My name's Jessica Rankin. I'm an artist and I live in Harlem in New York. So this piece is really just the very beginnings of a piece. And it's, I think, the most obviously landscape-oriented of the work, so it will end up being. And it actually grew out of, over the summer we spent a week in Colorado. I was teaching a workshop at the Anderson Ranch, and in many ways I think I'm a landscape artist. I do a lot of landscape drawings, and I think a lot about imagery from nature, and I draw a lot from imagery from nature. I traveled and went all through the canyons and gorges of Colorado, and they're just amazing. It was one of the most incredible, beautiful, beautiful places I've ever been. So this piece grew out of a second trip that we took to Australia after our son was born this last summer. And we went away with several of my sort of oldest friends and all of their children, and it was this very intense, strange holiday experience to be with all the people I grew up with and their kids and my child now back in Australia again. So once again I chronicled the constellations of the time and the view outside our window. We were in the hinterlands of Port Douglas, and not Port Douglas, the hinterlands of, well, anyway, we were somewhere really nice. And it had this beautiful view out the window, and so the phrases that kind of kept coming to me as I was thinking about this time there, and then the view sort of combined to make this landscape, which I superimposed with the constellations. And Aboriginal and Koori imagery is so sort of intense and ubiquitous in Australia. I think it would be very hard to not have it sort of impact you in some way growing up there. It's almost as big as the US. It's very hard to exist there and not be very aware of the environment. We're constantly in a state of drought. Well, I was born in Australia. I grew up in and around Melbourne and Sydney, and sometime in England when I was a kid. I mean, I guess I always wanted to be an artist. I didn't really have any other ambition that I can remember, except for maybe I wanted to be a ballerina or something when I was 5. But my father's an artist, and my mother was a poet, and my stepmother's a writer, as I said, and a poet. And I had no other sense that I could do anything else in the world. It never occurred to me, really. And so I really grew up in my dad's studio, kind of drawing and painting, and sometimes drawing and painting on his work, which was great. And gradually thread just sort of crept into it more and more. And I learned to embroider when I was a kid from a babysitter, so I always kind of had that resource. And by the time I went to grad school, it really had sort of started to dominate my work. And by the time I left grad school, it was absolutely dominant. I started showing a couple of years ago, but it took a long time. Sort of very slow process of working. Or it was always working, but I sort of had a lot of trouble finding a place to work in, or a niche, or a foothold somehow. You know, it was really hard. There was not a lot of breaks, and I was pretty isolated for a while. You know, this is about as organized as I've managed to get in terms of my threads, which is quite organized for me. But I get these at different embroidery stores. I mean, there's usually one in every city. And I have to say, they're not the most pleasant places to shop. I usually feel very judged and sort of exposed as a fraud whenever I try to buy anything there. What are you going to use that for? You can't use that for that. So I've actually started ordering online. I feel very inspired, despite having to keep going back, because I love going through the threads and finding the sort of different textures and silks and cottons and wool. And recently someone gave me some metallic thread that's, actually, the fibers themselves are actually metal, like the real precious metal. There's a lot of kind of rummaging through here, trying to find specific colors, and then realizing I don't have them. They often they often go into the work. They often kind of are just a reference to the work. Sometimes they're me trying to figure out an element of the work. I sort of go to paper to figure it out, and then I go back to the piece. So, you know, and then sometimes the ones that are just like a random note, end up being my favorite. I think this is from like 5 years ago, and for some reason I really like it. And I keep them around me in the studio the whole time I'm working. I go through the pile like many times a day, many times a week, and I rotate them on my studio walls. So right now I have all the landscape ones up, but this drawing is all through the work at the moment too. Yeah, this pile gets rifled through a lot. I came to New York. I sort of followed my parents to New York when I was in my early 20s. I've basically been living in and around New York ever since, in the East Village and waitressing and going to grad school. I went to Rutgers and living in Brooklyn and now up in Harlem. The only ways I could really do this was because for the first time I've had someone helping me in the studio. It just takes an incredibly long time. So I had poor Claire embroidering words for me. I sometimes put in the actual constellation, but I oftentimes leave it out. But I find, I find the narrative of the night sky to be very, very compelling, and I return to it again and again. And I love that every culture has their own meta narrative that you can sort of see in the stars. And so this is a postcard that I did for the Studio Museum in Harlem for their Harlem Postcard series. They always ask artists sort of either some people who live in and around Harlem, or have sort of an affiliation with Harlem somehow. Last year I had a show at PS1, and it was on one of the ground floor spaces, kind of a large show, probably my largest show to date. All of this work is ultimately going to White Cube for a show next April. So that's my next sort of major show that I'm working on. So this is a little model of the space that the show is going to be in, and we made to scale images of the work so that the work is so kind of translucent and minimal in some ways, and it's going to be such an enormous space that I was really worried that I wouldn't have enough. So luckily I have someone helping me who is able to build a model of the space, and we can sort of play around and basically put the show together. It's going to be at White Cube. April 20th is the opening next year.